Chapter 16. Subconsciously, Rain wandered to the edge of the garden. Immersed in regret and helpless yearning, she watched the shimmering surf spill onto the sand and then chase itself back into the moonlit sea. She was so wrapped up in her thoughts that she didn't notice soft footsteps in the grass behind her until a shadow moved directly across her line of vision. She froze, afraid that if she glanced around, she'd discover that it was only a hotel guest going for a late stroll on the beach. A breathless moment later, her dread exploded into a burst of elation when Liam put his hands on her waist and moved so close behind her that his shirt brushed her back and arms. For several moments, all Rain heard was the pounding of her heart and the restless rustling of palm fronds overhead. Then he said solemnly, "I have sisters, but something happened a year ago that tore us apart. They chose to side with my stepbrother, Alvin, because our father said in his will to let Alvin, who had never been a part of the family, have the larger share. Because I was against it, he manipulated them to go against me. Alvin died last year, and my sisters thought I had something to do with it." Rain understood immediately why he didn't want to talk about his family, and she dropped her head in shamed remorse for forcing him to talk about it. As if to reassure her, he said, "It's no big deal," though deep down it was, because it still hurt him to think his sisters would rather support a total stranger over him and then accuse him of murdering Alvin. "I'm so sorry for asking," Rain whispered, "but thank you for telling me." He slid his hands soothingly up and down her arms, and when he spoke again, he hesitated between each sentence as if he found it difficult to articulate what he was trying to tell her. "Neither of us knew the other one existed until a few years ago when my father sent for him and told him he was a Thompson and the rightful heir to the wealth as he was older than me. Immediately after he learned he had a wealthy family, he brought his wife and children into the Thompsons' main mansion and began to act like he owned everything. Remembering all the times he'd fought with Alvin for how he was misusing their family wealth and ruining the company Liam had worked half his life to build with his father, he felt a fresh, new anger towards the deceased. Alvin, Liam thought with an inner grimace, had all the makings of a bastard son and an irresponsible man who didn't care about the aftermath of his actions. No person in their right mind would sit back and watch some random stranger who was suddenly brought into your life as your stepbrother ruin everything you've built in the blink of an eye. Whenever Liam tried to talk some sense into him, they always ended up fighting, with Alvin going to his sisters and manipulating them. "I was a bastard too," Liam told Rain. "I was conceived out of wedlock by a struggling Chinese woman and a wealthy Italian man who wanted desperately to have a male child. So Alvin used that to his advantage to manipulate my sisters and told them that I planned to take everything for myself and run back to my mother's country and leave them with nothing," he said, absent-mindedly stroking her hips. "Though I despised Alvin, I like his son very much. He has all the makings of a Thompson, unlike his father." Warning flags went up in Rain's mind about his sisters easily believing Alvin over a brother they'd known all their lives, but the last thing she wanted to do was pry further. Instead, she seized the most uplifting part of his story and smiled as she turned around to face him and made her comment. "What's your nephew's name?" "Milo. Did he also blame you for his father's death?" she asked curiously. "No," he said, but his expression had softened enough to make Rain guess that he indeed liked his nephew, as he'd said. He looked away from her before he added, staring over her head at the sea, "He likes me more than he did his father." And after several seconds, he added in a low voice, "And I like him very much, like my own." Tears stung the back of Rain's eyes at the wealth of concealed emotion in that last sentence. He tipped his chin down and looked at her. "What else would you like to know, Red?" The only thing Rain wanted to know now was how to extricate them both from this serious topic. Despite her earlier belief that she was utterly insignificant to him, the truth was that he'd come back here to tell her whatever she wanted to know. He'd actually come back. That was all that mattered to her. After a moment's thought, she came up with a playful way to answer his last question and hopefully transform their mood. Trying to look extremely serious, she said, "There is only one more question I really need an answer to. It's very personal, but it's extremely important to me." His brows lifted inquiringly, but his expression was so wary and unenthusiastic that Rain laughed and asked the extremely important question, "How many languages do you speak?" His startled chuckle transformed into a lazy, sensual smile as he pretended to seriously contemplate his answer. "I'm not certain," he said, shifting his hand down her spine and drawing her closer. "I'll name them for you, and you can count them for me. How about that?" She nodded, his gaze fixed on her mouth, and he bent his head. I'm fluent in Italian. His warm mouth touched hers and slid languorously from corner to corner and back again in a long, slow exploration of the shape and texture of her lips that twisted Rain into knots. And Mandarin. He deepened the kiss, his mouth stroking hers insistently, his arms tightening. His tongue slid across the seam between her lips, and Rain's pulse rate soared. And a bit of Spanish. His hand curved around her nape, his mouth slowly opening on hers. His tongue made a brief foray into her mouth, probing lightly, and Rain returned the intimate kiss, wrapping her arms fiercely around his neck and molding her body to the hardening contours of his. To Rain's surprise, her response made him abruptly end that kiss. Instead, he brushed a light kiss on her forehead and whispered, "I also speak a little of Greek." Touching his lips to her temple, he added, "And a little Korean, and a little Japanese." He slid his mouth across her cheekbone to her ear, and his warm breath made her shiver and lean into him as he finished playfully, "How many was that?" Despite Liam's light-hearted tone, her shivering response made him yearn to make her shiver again, only harder and longer, and he had to force himself to lift his head. He could not fathom why kissing her had such a powerful physical effect on him, and he was genuinely relieved that he'd managed to name all the languages he spoke while keeping things from getting out of hand. Rain stirred in his arms and tipped her chin up. "You forgot to mention English," she said with a smile. In the interest of conformity, Liam suddenly felt that the English language needed to be mentioned in the context of a kiss, just as the others had been. "Did I?" he asked, slowly rubbing his thumb over her soft bottom lip. Then he looked at what his thumb was doing, and his restraint snapped. He pressed his thumb down hard, forcing her lips apart, and abruptly seized her mouth in a hungry, devouring kiss. His tongue plunged into her mouth, and the kiss went wild. She kissed him back, her fingers flexing against the muscles in his back, clasping him to her while his hands slid restlessly over the sides of her breasts, then swept behind her, cupping her hips and pulling her tightly against his rigid erection. When Liam finally pulled his mouth from hers, lust was raging through his entire nerve stream, and the idea of walking toward her villa in the condition his body was in struck him as being too humorous to consider. Instead, he held her in his arms, her face pressed to his chest, her auburn hair spilling over his arm in a rumpled cascade. Lifting his gaze from the top of her head, he looked out at the shifting sea, his emotions caught somewhere between excitement, amusement, and disbelief. She was leaning against him for support, her hands splayed over his pounding heart, her fingers moving slightly in a feathery caress. He liked the way she was touching him. He knew she was in much the same emotional and physical state he was in, and he liked that, too. In fact, he liked everything about her. Chapter 17. In fact, he liked everything about her. He liked her humor, her warmth, and her sensuality. He liked her courage, her honesty, and her pride. He liked her smile and the musical sound of her laughter. He liked her face, and her hair, and the way she'd laid her hand on his jaw earlier, when she said, "I have a feeling you're a whole lot more than just another pretty face." He liked the way her body fit itself to his, and the way her breasts felt in his hands. Liam checked the direction of his thoughts and tipped his chin down, ready to relinquish his hold on her and walk back to the suite. "How many languages was that?" he asked again with a grin. She lifted her head from his chest, leaned back in his arms, and looked at him blankly for a moment. Then she gave him a smile filled with charming chagrin. "I don't know. I lost count after you said Mandarin. Then we'll have to start over." "Oh," she said on a choked laugh, and dropped her forehead weakly against his chest. "But not here," Liam said, amused and flattered by her reaction. Then he curved his arm around her waist and directed her toward the villa. As they walked across the grass, he tried to remember the last time a woman had made him experience such strong, frequent, and repeated transitions from laughter to lust, and frustration to fascination. He couldn't remember that ever happening to him before. Not him. The experience was surprising, challenging, and exhilarating. He didn't want to do anything to diminish it, or the woman who affected him that way, and as he glanced at the open terrace doors, he wondered if it was a mistake to take her to bed in her boyfriend's hotel room. Then he wondered exactly who he thought that would bother, her? Or him? Or both of them? The possibility that he might not like the idea of going to bed with her in another man's hotel room seemed ridiculous, since he'd done similar things in the past without the slightest shame nor regret. He'd even done worse than that by going to married women's beds when their husbands were out on business trips, too busy to satisfy their women. In view of that, Liam decided that his concern was strictly for her sake, until they walked into the suite and they both saw his navy sport jacket hanging on the back of a chair in the living room. Rain reacted with a surprised statement of the obvious. "When you left earlier, you forgot your jacket." "That might have been difficult to explain to your boyfriend," Liam replied without intending to say any such thing. The boyfriend was an off-limits subject under the circumstances, and he couldn't believe he'd just been foolish enough, or crass enough, to bring him up at such a time as this. Rain fell silent for a moment as she imagined the scenario where Max would find a male jacket hanging behind a chair when he returned. But then she thought of the possibility of that not happening because I would have noticed it and she began but stopped. "And what?" Liam inquired, even though that completely compounded his last transgression and made him even more annoyed with himself. Rain shot him an uneasy smile and bent down to check on the sleeping dog instead. Eric's nose was cool and moist, and he opened his eyes when she touched him. Then he gave his tail a feeble wag and drifted back to sleep. Satisfied, she stood up and rubbed her palms on the sides of her pants. She was trying to think what she would have done with Liam's jacket, and she wished the subject hadn't come up because it was making her feel sneaky and guilty about going to bed with him here in Max's suite, when moments before she'd been happy and excited. "I guess I would have left it at the front desk in a bag with your name on it." Liam knew that was a perfectly logical solution, but for some reason, he suddenly found the notion extremely unpleasant, almost as if it were he, rather than merely his jacket, that she would be pulling a bag over and hustling out to the front desk. "Or I guess I could have put it in the closet and waited for you to phone and tell me what to do with it." Liam restrained the idiotic urge to ask her if she thought her boyfriend and he wore the same size jacket. Then he glanced at the telephone and imagined her boyfriend standing there, answering Liam's phone call about the jacket or playing back Liam's voicemail about it. As he looked at the telephone, it occurred to him that the red message light he'd noticed a while back was no longer flashing, as it had been earlier. That meant Rain had already retrieved her voicemail message sometime during the evening. He glanced at her, half expecting her to be looking at the telephone too, but she was looking at the bed with a decidedly guilty expression, rather than the soft, yielding expression she'd had a few minutes ago. Although her so-called boyfriend wasn't present in the room, he'd become an utter obstacle to their unrestrained enjoyment of each other, Liam realized with disgust. "Is he still planning to arrive tomorrow?" he asked, trying his best to mask his disgust and anger towards a boyfriend he didn't know. Rain shook her head. "No, the day after tomorrow," she said, but their conversation about Max had made her feel so uneasy that she couldn't look at the bed without feeling despicable about being there with Liam, about to literally cheat on him with another man. Though she'd decided to end her relationship with Max, she hadn't ended it yet. Ethically speaking, this wasn't her hotel room or her bed. Max was paying for them. "Decide now," her brain prompted. Decide. Decide. Engaged in her personal struggle with ethics and logistics, Rain turned in shock when, from the corner of her eye, she saw Liam shrugging into his jacket. "Wait, are you leaving already?" she asked, sounding as stricken as she felt. He nodded. Then he partially dispelled her fears over his reasons by capturing her wrist and pulling her firmly into his arms. He looked amused, not annoyed, she noted. "But why?" she asked, the slight shake in her voice betraying her fears of him leaving. "Because," he said amusingly, "something tells me that my little Red thinks it's naughty to sleep with a man in another man's room." Rain's eyes widened at his acuity, but the way he called her, "my little Red," made her heart soar to cloud 9 and made her stomach flutter like a million butterflies were doing a happy dance in the pit of her stomach. To hide her delightful pleasure at the nickname, she cleared her voice and said, "What about what we planned to do? First of all, answer me. Did I guess wrong about the room?" he countered with a knowing smile. "Not exactly, but, and I believe that if we sleep together on our first date, one of us will regret it tomorrow, thinking it was just cheap, casual sex." "You mean you?" Rain asked, a bit stunned, and he laughed briefly. "No, you." Rain thought about what he was saying, and she made no effort to hide the yearning or confusion she felt. "I never realized what a prude I am." In reply, he slid his fingers through the sides of her hair and turned her face up to his for a demanding kiss that ended on a gruff command. "Get over it by tomorrow." Rain tried to think of a clever response but instead said softly, "I'll try." Satisfied, Liam dropped his hands and turned toward the terrace doors, seemingly intending to walk outside and around the building again. "There's a front door right here, you know," Rain pointed out. "If I walk past that bed with you, I'll have you in it within 30 seconds. You're awfully confident, aren't you? She teased. He tilted his head back, closed his eyes, and said, Please, just dare me to prove it. Give me one excuse. That's all I need right now. Just one little excuse and my fragile new principles won't matter. Rain wisely decided not to, and he opened his eyes. I'll pick you and Eric up at 11. We'll take him to a vet in town and spend the day on the island. And the night, he added meaningfully. When she didn't object, he asked, Do you like casinos? Rain looked at the man she'd agreed to spend the night with, despite knowing he was a womanizer who wouldn't love or stay loyal, and said with a charming smile, Yes. He caught her meaning and grinned boyishly. Then bring a change of clothes for the evening, something very nice. He turned and disappeared through the doorway. Chapter 18. As the morning sun rose from the horizon, its golden rays touched the white, huge mansion on the small island, bathing it in a gentle, warm light that made it shine like a jewel in the quiet dawn. Seated on the terrace of the mansion, which originally belonged to Neil Weiner, with a cup of morning coffee, a laptop, and a few documents on his desk, Liam looked toward the railing as the mansion's caretaker swore under his breath and glared at an approaching group of reporters. The caretaker was a middle-aged man with gray hair and aging blue eyes. He looked down at the reporters and turned to Liam. They never listen. They're back again. You might want to go back inside, he warned Liam as they began to set up their cameras upon spotting Liam on the terrace. He's up there. Mr. Weiner, we've come a long way to have a word with you, yelled one of the reporters with an accent in his English. Liam swore under his breath and raised the documents, concealing his face. He enjoyed his time on the terrace and liked working there, but ever since the reporters of this country had discovered that someone was staying in the mansion, they believed it was Neil and his family and kept coming back to have a word with him. I don't know how Neil puts up with this. I'd start waving a shotgun at them if I had to endure all this invasion all the time. No wonder he's hiding his children from the media. Until yesterday, the mansion had been peacefully secluded, but some eager fans of Neil's had seen the mansion and realized to whom it belonged. The word had spread like wildfire across the island. Within hours, the mansion became a tourist attraction of its own, with reporters and paparazzi milling around the property hoping to capture a picture of Neil or his family and making a damned nuisance of themselves. The more Neil and Mia hid their children from the media, the more curious and persistent the reporters became in trying to know them. Now, Liam, who had come to this island to get some work done, was regretting it. He hadn't had a moment of peace ever since word spread that Neil was the one staying there, which was why he'd ended up going to the Island Club restaurant yesterday. Some of them were still hanging around last night when he returned from his evening with Rain, and to give Liam some peace, Neil's caretaker had moved the mansion's barriers back as soon as Liam was inside. Now the mansion was surrounded by a perimeter fence, which isolated them from annoying pedestrians but gave them no protection from persistent reporters and paparazzi. I'm checking with the other properties to see if they have a more secluded area that's isolated enough to keep you away from the media, the caretaker said in the resigned tone of a man who'd been through this drill many times in the past. Unfortunately, for now, you'll have to use the back entrance to get in and out of the mansion, the caretaker added. He had been at the mansion long enough to know how Neil had escaped the annoying reporters the last time he came with his family on a short vacation. That's fine, Liam said. I have some errands to do in town this morning. I'll tell your driver to have the car ready to leave in. He paused, waiting for Liam's answer. Liam glanced at his watch. It was 10:15. In half an hour. All right. I'll try my best to make sure the reporters are out of here before you return, the caretaker said, but Liam waved his hand dismissively. I won't be coming back here tonight. I'd rather stay in a hotel, he said, remembering his arrangements with Rain tonight. At first, he'd wanted to bring her here and let them have all the fun they could in the world, but looking down at the reporters, he realized it was a terrible idea. You'll probably get more peace and quiet that way, the caretaker said with an apologetic sigh. He started to leave. Then he turned and said with a slight smile, Mr. Galvera phoned from New York earlier. I told him about the reporters. He said to tell you everything is delightfully quiet and pleasant where he is. Liam acknowledged Neil's joke with a brief smile. Neil and his family were staying at Liam's apartment in New York while he finished attending some important meetings with some investors there, while Mia went there for a tour with her children. Neil must be having the best time of his life with no reporters on his trail while Liam suffered to get them off him here. When the caretaker left, Liam leaned back in his chair, his coffee and work momentarily forgotten as his thoughts drifted to his extraordinary behavior with Rain Wallace the night before. This morning, in the bright light of day, he was amused and a little embarrassed by the lengths he'd gone to please her. He'd acted completely unlike himself last night, and everything surprised him now that he thought about it. When she'd asked him to help a stray dog, he'd promptly summoned an ambulance and physician and then volunteered to help take the dog to a vet like some eager errand boy. Later, when she refused to sleep with him or see him again unless he told her about himself, she'd been giving him an ultimatum, and he'd known it at the time. He'd known it, he'd refused to be manipulated, and he'd left, exactly as he should have done. But then, driven by the severest case of brain-numbing lust in his recollection, he gave in and went back to answer her questions like a fool. And if that weren't odd enough, he then had a funny sense of chivalry and decided not to sleep with her in her boyfriend's hotel room. Instead, he chose to wait until today and take her to his own place instead. That particular decision to wait was doubly bizarre in view of the fact that he'd been needlessly and outrageously blunt with her all evening about his intentions to sleep with her. In hindsight, most of his behavior the night before was baffling and yet, not entirely. Minutes after he'd arrived at her hotel last night, everything about her started to resonate with him. At least, that's how he'd felt then. But today, without the moonlight and music, and without the special circumstances that had made the night before feel important, the magic might be gone. At this moment, Liam wasn't sure how he felt about that. Ever since his family had turned their backs on him and accused him of his stepbrother's death, believing he was the only one with a strong motive to kill Alvin, and his sister had taken Lily back from him, Liam had felt himself becoming more hardened and detached from many things he used to enjoy, especially women. They no longer amused him or gave him the pleasure of just being in their presence as they used to in the past. He had become a man who did nothing but spend his days buried in his work. He had become cold, almost numb, to everything that once brought him joy. Now, a beautiful young redhead with eyes like the greenest grass in the world was getting to him in a way no other woman had. What surprised him the most was the fact that the thought of her had kept him awake, wondering what it would have felt like if he'd taken her to bed last night. In the midst of that thought, Liam noticed another bus headed straight toward the mansion, and he cursed for the 100th time under his breath, knowing more reporters had come to ruin his mood and disrupt his work. He glanced at his watch and pushed his chair back. He still had to pack an overnight case because he would be damned if he came back here for any reason at all. However, as he strolled away from the terrace, he couldn't help but wonder if Rain still wanted to go through with the plan or if the magic from last night had faded and she had changed her mind. Chapter 19. Rain's lavender suitcase lay at the foot of the bed, packed and ready to be carried. From the white sofa in the sitting room, she idly petted Eric's head while she stared at that piece of luggage and nervously tried to recapture the emotions she'd had last night, emotions that had made it seem completely appropriate and perfectly right for her to agree to spend the night with Liam. This morning, what she was planning to do seemed a little insane and completely stupid. She thought about how overjoyed she had felt last night when Liam walked up behind her in the garden and held her waist while he answered all of her questions. In retrospect, she had apparently become totally smitten with a man merely because he'd been reluctantly willing to mention a few things about his personal life and to reveal the languages he spoke. That made no sense at all. Obviously, she'd been absurdly affected by the setting they were in. The setting, combined with his fantastic good looks and the fact that she'd once had a crush on him, had evidently seduced her, which was exactly what he had intended to happen. From early in the evening, he'd made it crystal clear that seduction was on his mind. He'd said it himself that he did intend to seduce her. Even the way he kissed was deliberately seductive. Those slow, stirring kisses that turned hot and demanding, the suggestive way he'd held her hips clamped against his rigid thighs, and his hands skillfully caressing her breast like something he'd done 1,000 times before while he kissed her. That was kissing with a single-minded, unmistakable goal, she realized now. He'd done everything with the intention to take her to bed and then after that, abandon her like a piece of banana peel. However, she was not foolish enough to feel honor-bound to sleep with him just because she'd agreed to do it last night. When she woke up this morning, nothing they did last night seemed as exciting as it had been the night before. In the light of day, she knew she couldn't go through with sleeping with him while still in a relationship that hadn't yet ended. Even though Max wasn't in the picture, was she willing to subject herself to a one-night fling that could forever cause her heartache whenever she thought about it? Last night, after Liam left, she'd been too nervous and excited to sleep, So she'd sorted through the clothes she'd brought with her to the island club, trying to put together outfits that would be exactly right, no matter what Liam decided they should do while they were together. By the time she was finished, it was nearly 4 a.m. and several outfits were neatly laid out beside her suitcase, including shoes, handbags, and accessories. The only thing she hadn't decided on was what she should be wearing when he arrived to pick her up and how to wear her hair. This morning, she'd been too preoccupied to worry about her appearance. Instead of fussing with her hair, she'd pulled it up into a ponytail, and she'd chosen the first articles of clothing she noticed when she opened her closet door: a pair of jeans, a mint green, short-sleeved cropped shirt, and a pair of sneakers. With a nervous sigh, Rain leaned down and rubbed the short hair on Eric's head. "This is all your fault," she pursed her lips. "Just because he helped me rescue you, I felt obliged to sleep with him." She broke off as 3 short, solid knocks sounded on the villa's front door. Her heart missed a beat as she knew without a doubt who it was. She glanced at her wristwatch. It was exactly 11 o'clock. She was out of her seating position in a flash. Anxiously, she wiped her sweaty palms against her pants and began to head towards the door. Eric rolled to his feet and walked beside her, trailing the makeshift leash she'd created by tying 2 belts together from the white robes the hotel provided to its guests. With her hand on the doorknob, Rain hesitated, nervously bracing herself to confront the handsome man she'd agreed, in a moment of obvious insanity, to spend the night with. She fixed a bright smile on her face, and on the chance that he intended to kiss her hello, she purposely took a few steps backward while pulling the door open. Liam's tall, wide-shouldered frame loomed in the doorway. Clad in casual black slacks and an expensive-looking navy blue knit t-shirt that deepened his tan and made his arms look even more muscular and strong, the shirt outlined the details of his solid, well-built chest. She swallowed hard as she took in his looks. He looked immortally handsome and incredibly sexy. Rain took another cautious step backward to avoid him, knowing if he touched her, she might end up melting into him like she had last night. "You're right on time," she said brightly. He paused momentarily, measuring the distance she'd carefully put between them. Then he lifted knowing dark eyes to hers and slowly walked inside. "Being on time is one of my few good traits," he replied with a shrug, glancing casually around the room. Rain watched him register her lavender suitcase lying on the bedside. Then he transferred his attention to the dog who was directly in front of him. "How is Eric?" "He seems to be in good condition this morning," Rain replied, looking at the bag in Liam's hand. "I hope you have a leash and collar in there. I had to tie together 2 belts from bathrobes to take him outside this morning." "I noticed. He looks like he's escaped from a spa," he joked, handing the bag to her. Memories of the laughter they'd shared last night came flooding back, drowning out some of the uneasy unfamiliarity Rain had felt all morning. "I'll lock the doors for you," Liam volunteered, already walking toward the terrace. "That's very kind of you," Rain said to his back as she unrolled the top of the flat, almost weightless paper bag. "I couldn't find a store that sold leashes and I ran out of time, so I bought those instead," he said, walking outside to pull the terrace glass door closed. From the bag, Rain pulled out 2 of the most garish neckties she'd ever seen, one with palm trees and the other with little drawings of cats in neon orange on an electric green background. Smiling to herself at how colorful the neckties were, she crouched in front of Eric, hiding him from Liam's view, and quickly took off the makeshift leash. Her fingers moved quickly as she tied the palm tree necktie around Eric's neck in a Windsor knot. She glanced over her shoulder as Liam pulled the terrace curtains over the glass doors he'd just closed. Moments later, she straightened the ends of the necktie with a skilled tug. She then took her sunglasses off her head and placed them on Eric's head, giving him a reassuring pat to keep him from shaking them off. "Now he looks more like a tourist with those colorful ties," Rain said as Liam stopped right behind her. Turning around while still remaining crouched down, she gave him a clear view of Eric. "At least the ties are light," Liam started, then burst out laughing when he saw the dog with sunglasses. He looked down at Rain with warm eyes and a lazy grin. "Very clever of you." Rain stood up slowly, smiling back at him, her eyes locked with his, and she suddenly felt the spell of the night before begin to wrap itself around them. He obviously felt it too, because he slipped his hands around her waist in a light caress and pulled her to him, and his deep voice acquired a husky, intimate note. "Hi, Little Red," he said, smiling into her eyes as he slowly began to lean towards her lips. "Hi," Rain whispered back, fighting to keep the flush of color that rushed up her face and neck at his words. The room's telephone rang, and she jumped back, startled. Then she looked guiltily at it, knowing Max was the one calling. Liam glanced at the ringing phone, mentally grimacing at the boyfriend's irritating sense of timing. Instead of kissing her as he'd intended to do, he dropped his hands and said, "Let's get out of here." Rain nodded and bent down to remove Eric's necktie. Then she knotted it together with the other necktie in the bag, creating a long, makeshift leash. "He was a little uneasy about being on a leash when I took him outside in the garden this morning," she told Liam as they walked down the path from the villas toward the hotel's main entrance, "but he didn't try to get away from me." "Which proves he knows a good steak when he eats one," Liam replied, but he noticed that the big dog seemed content to walk close by her side, rather than trying to test the length of his makeshift leash. He thought it was surprising that a wild stray would come so willingly to her heel. Evidently, he decided wryly, Rain Wallace had that same effect on male strays, whether they were canine or human. "Let's hope he's just as submissive about getting into a car," he added. Liam had already put the convertible top up so the dog couldn't jump out of the car, but no amount of urging or shoving from Rain could get the animal to climb into it. After tossing her suitcase into the trunk, Liam went around to the passenger side of the car to help Rain. But as he approached, he ended up standing back, enjoying the view instead. She was bending over the dog, trying to plant his front feet onto the floor of the back seat, and for the first time, Liam realized that from the rear, Rain Wallace looked sexy in snug jeans. He couldn't help but notice how her snug jeans accentuated the curve of her hips and the delicate arch of her back. She was bent over the dog, her movements drawing his gaze to the gentle sway of her rear and reminding him of the feel of his hands on them last night when he'd kissed her. His pulse quickened, and he felt a primal urge to reach out, to touch her again. Rain, completely unaware of his presence behind her, continued to try to plant Eric's front feet onto the floor of the back seat, her voice soft and coaxing as she tried to guide the dog in. Liam's eyes traveled the length of her body, lingering on the small of her back that looked a perfect fit for his arm to wrap around. He imagined his hands there, guiding her closer, feeling the heat of her skin beneath his fingers, and he cursed under his breath and looked away. "If you get in first," he suggested, his voice huskier than intended, "Eric may be willing to follow you." The ploy worked, and Liam closed the passenger door behind the dog. Then he walked around the car and opened the driver's door so Rain could climb out of the backseat and get into the front with him. As Liam's car sped away from the hotel's driveway, another car behind them pulled up, and a man with a camera exited it and stretched out his arms while speaking to his partner in the driver's seat. "I wonder what Mr. Wallace would think of his sister being with a man he wants to frame and ruin. This family shit is getting more interesting," he said as he went back inside the car and told his partner, "We need to report this to Mr. Wallace." Chapter 20. A local bar in downtown Zen. The bar was dimly lit, casting an intimate glow over the scantily clad women dancing erotically on the platform. Their hips swayed rhythmically to the pounding bass, bodies moving with a seductive grace as they spun around polished poles. The air was thick with smoke, and the faint scent of cheap perfume mingled with the stale odor of spilled beer. Neon lights flickered, casting colorful shadows on the women as they moved, their skin glistening under the lights. Jason Wallace sat in the corner, nursing a glass of whiskey, his hazel eyes taking in the sight before him with a mixture of admiration and desire. A cigarette burned between his fingers, the smoke curling up in lazy spirals. He took a deep drag, the nicotine hitting his lungs and offering a brief moment of solace. He eyed one of the dancers, a young woman with blonde hair and breasts as big as two huge balloons placed against her chest, with a rounded ass, just the way he liked them. Her movements were seductive and enticing. He knew he would send for her soon, to one of the special rooms upstairs where privacy was guaranteed and he could mold her the way he saw fit, a whore like her. It would have been disgusting to his old self to be sitting here in a local bar thinking about taking a cheap whore to bed, when he was a rich man with elite women fighting to be in his bed. But he'd lost everything to a point where elite women snickered at the sight of him. He had become a laughingstock in the circle of his elite friends. First, he'd lost to Neil Wayner, who had now become the pride of their country, with the media willing to do anything to know about his personal life, while forgetting about him the moment he lost his grace in the business world. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen his own face on television or in the front pages of newspapers. Nobody cared about him enough to give him the attention he deserved in the media. It was as if people were already fed up with him even before he'd lost his grace, and they were looking for a great opportunity to remove him from the list of top wealthy men. Just as he was about to beckon the blonde woman forward to vent his anger on her by fucking her until she wouldn't be able to walk again, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He considered ignoring it, but he knew he was expecting news from the men he had sent to follow Liam Thompson. To some, it might seem foolish, this vendetta against Thompson. But Jason knew the truth and why he now wanted nothing but to bring the man down, just like he had been brought down. Liam Thompson was the reason he had lost his father's wealth in a matter of months. The sting of that realization still burned, a constant reminder of his failure. Though Thompson hadn't been the one to buy and trick him into selling his father's chain of restaurants, he was responsible for it because it was one of his investors who'd made that deal with him, making him believe he was about to overthrow Liam Thompson in the business world. Jason fished out his phone and saw a message notification from his men. With a growing sense of anticipation, he tapped into the message, his eyes narrowing as he saw a series of pictures flood his screen. He selected one, and in an instant, he was out of his chair, the sight before him leaving him in stunned disbelief. "No way in hell," he exclaimed, his voice barely audible over the thumping music. In the photo, his sister was being kissed by Liam Thompson. He scrolled through the images rapidly, each one more incriminating than the last. There was Rain and Liam on a terrace, their figures partially obscured by the shadows of a tree. Another showed them in an intimate embrace, their faces close, eyes locked in a private moment. A humorless laugh escaped Jason's throat. He had been relieved to know that his sister was in a relationship with his best friend, Max. Max, who he believed would help Rain buy back the company Jason had been tricked into selling if she asked him for help. But now, it turned out his sister wasn't asking for his help but was busy cheating on Max with Liam Thompson. The anger bubbled up inside him, a toxic mix of betrayal and rage. That little bitch of a sister. What did she think she was doing, allowing Thompson to kiss her like that? Since when had they been seeing each other behind his back? All this while, he'd been at peace knowing that soon Rain would act on buying back their chain of restaurants with the help of Max. But he'd been wrong yet again. She was busy playing the whore for Thompson. Didn't she know that Thompson, Wayner, and he were sworn enemies since their time in the military? Or was she trying to get revenge on him for selling their family's restaurant by being with Thompson? That made sense, but she was fucking mistaken because he would never allow her to be with that fucker. Never. She was his sister, and he may have lost authority over her, but he would do everything in his power to make sure she never ended up with Liam. Just like he'd done when she was a teenager, he would do it again. He stared at the photos, his mind racing with thoughts of how to teach them both separate lessons. He had to act, and he had to act fast. This new revelation changed the course of everything, including his plans to drag Liam's name through the mud just like his own name had been. His vendetta against Thompson was no longer just about fame and class, it was personal. He would make sure Thompson paid dearly for this, and he would make sure his sister realized how Thompson was using her to get to him. His hands trembled as he lit another cigarette, taking a long drag to steady himself. The woman on the platform was forgotten, his focus now solely on the images on his phone and how he'd get his revenge on Liam. He might no longer have the power to battle Liam, but he knew exactly who would do it for him: Max Everett. They were friends, after all, and Max would believe anything he said. But then, how was he going to make Max take Thompson as his enemy? He had to think, to plan his next move carefully. There was no room for error. His sister's betrayal cut deep, but it also provided him with a new weapon in his battle against Liam Thompson. Jason's mind churned with possibilities. Then an idea suddenly popped into his mind, a way that would work in his favor. Oh, he was going to enjoy this so much. His life had become meaningless and boring after all. He'd not only lost the Wallace chain of restaurants but also the money he'd gotten from selling them. But now, he had a new way to entertain himself and destroy Thompson at the same time. He put out his cigarette and downed the rest of his whiskey, the alcohol burning its way down his throat. Pocketing his phone, he stood up and headed for the exit, his mind already formulating a plan. Liam Thompson had made a powerful enemy, and Jason would stop at nothing to see him destroyed. But first, he had to call Max and let him know what his girlfriend was up to with Liam Thompson.